everybody. My name's Heather Whiteside. I'm going to go next, and I think it might kind of be a better segue, actually. So, as was mentioned in the introduction, I'm a PhD student at Simon Fraser University, and by reading the title of my presentation, it probably won't come as any surprise that my dissertation research is focused on P3s in Canada. And by P3s, I mean public-private partnerships. These are, specifically because there's different types, these are the for-profit, ostensibly public infrastructure, but it's financed, designed, operated, and built by private consortia. And the contracts are often 30 years in length, plus the construction phase. So it's a sort of the most recent and significant form of privatization in Canada. What this research then has shown me, among other things, and what I in particular want to or hope to contribute here today, is that it isn't always the large policy changes that occur around economic crises that matter, but also the small changes. So not only the most obvious, but sometimes the subtle things, and not only the immediate, but the things that unfold over the long term. And then maybe more importantly though, not only what changes, but what doesn't and why. So in this sense then, dispossession as privatization doesn't always happen overnight, and it's not always entrenched as a policy norm in a sort of high profile or splashy way. But rather, as Marjorie Griffin Cohen argued in 1997, and this remains entirely relevant today, it often gradually occurs through a, quote, steady erosion of programs and institutions, achieved by the introduction of 1,000 little budget cuts, tax changes, and hard-to-explain technical manipulations to existing legislation. And I can provide that quote later if you like, or the source rather. So it's this insight then that, at least in part, is inspiring the discussion that follows. So I'd like to provide then a brief sketch of what the BC and Ontario governments have been up to for the past decade or so, sometimes subtly, sometimes obviously, to entrench ongoing, regularized privatization initiatives within the very heart of public policy making. These efforts have created a situation where P3s are now the standard way to deliver hospital infrastructure, large hospital infrastructure projects, as well as large infrastructure projects in other sectors such as transportation. And I would argue that they've also taken steps, these governments have taken steps over the past 10 years to entrench this policy and insulate it from broader economic crises, as well as insulate it from its own internally produced dislocations and contradictions. I'm calling this set of initiatives an enabling field, and these P3 enabling fields allow the model to weather crises such as the one that we saw with the recent financial crisis and the way that it impacted P3s, and also then to retain their privileged policy position. So this is despite all of the drawbacks, which I don't have time to go into here. Hopefully you're familiar with this. It's much higher costs over the long run due to the use of private financing, enmeshing important public services within these volatile financial markets, more precarious working conditions for staff, potentially cut corners leading to problems for patients in hospitals, and other, I mean, it would be different for different types of infrastructure projects. And of course, reduce accountability and democratic oversight. Okay, so what are P3 enabling fields, and how has this helped entrench the P3 model? Well, I'm focusing here on BC and Ontario because they're the leading jurisdictions in P3 development, and my examples come from the health sector because this is the main target of these P3 initiatives, along with other sectors as well, but hospitals in particular have been targeted. And just before I go through these elements, I'd like to note that even though P3s in Ontario were developed initiated under the NDP and then later under the PC government, they really got going, these enabling fields, under the McGuinty government in 2003 and beyond, and in BC under the Liberal government of Campbell in 2001. Okay, so these are the three elements then, sort of three different groups of elements of these enabling fields. One is enabling legislation and capital planning frameworks. And these are the nuts and bolts of the P3 enabling field as far as I'm concerned. They this includes, among other things, the Capital Asset Management Framework in BC and its counterpart, the Infrastructure Planning, Financing, Procurement Framework in Ontario. And then there's, of course, the Alternative Financing and Procurement Model in Ontario. And that doesn't exist in BC. I would argue that AFP is P3. There's very minor differences, but a sort of counterpart to that, which I don't have time to go into, but it's interesting, is Bill 94, which allowed for the privatization of support staff operated in P3 hospitals. So there's also then, so just to provide one example of what this does, is the CAMF, just for instance in BC, requires that all ministries and local authorities that seek funds for projects that the threshold used to be 20 million and now it's 50 million, but that's much more recent. They must explain first why a P3 is not justified, rather than explaining why a P3 is justified. And so just to put this in context, you can't build a hospital for under 200 million, and often they cost much more than that. So this threshold is very low, relatively speaking. Now, the supportive secondary reforms, these are elements that weren't necessarily, I'm not suggesting that Regional Health Authority restructuring in BC that happened in 2001 was, had like the ulterior motive was to facilitate P3s. Same with the creation of LHINs in Ontario in 2006. But they have there's a happy coincidence where the rules and procedures that they implement and follow just so happen to favor privatization and sort of streamline public-private partnership development. And then finally, institutional support is the backbone, I would say, of the enabling field. And the creation of new specialized government agencies, or what are often called P3 units, is the prime example of this. So that's Partnerships BC in BC and Infrastructure Ontario in Ontario. These agencies then are quasi-independent, they're well-funded, the staff members are often cherry-picked from the private sector, and they perform contradictory, or what would appear to any rational person as contradictory roles. They both promote and evaluate P3s, for instance. They also build up, they act as a knowledge center where they build up sources of expertise around P3 development. There's a lot more to be said about this, of course, including the differences that exist between both P3 enabling fields in both provinces, and also the way that it's changed over time and the degree of pragmatism that exists. But I think that I'll just focus instead on less sort of the details of each of these items and more importantly on what they do. So, taken together, I would argue that the items that form these P3 provincial enabling fields do three things. They routinize, institutionalize, and depoliticize privatization policy in various ways. So routines or routinization, for instance, is produced through the development of different protocols and the sort of normalization of the procedures that are involved with privatization. And even just a more simple example would be the standardization of documents and bidding stages and so on. Institutionalization then is sort of both literal in the sense of creating new institutions, but also in the sense of process-based, kind of a generation of a sense of permanency and so on. And then finally, depoliticization essentially has shifted commodification into this technocratic realm, where it's now moved away from originally P3s were, I mean, they were always privatization by stealth, but they were often high-profile politicized cabinet decisions. And now it's kind of entered this mundane world of the kind of bureaucratic procedures and private consultants and accountants and fairness auditors and so on that really, covers the fact that this is commodification that's occurring. Okay, so these enabling fields, though, have done little to actually resolve any underlying problems with P3s, because I would argue the problem is with the model itself. So you'd have to scrap the model altogether. But in light of the problems that I mentioned earlier, and in particular that P3s cost more in the long run when private financing is used, in 2007, 2008, when the crisis hit, and specifically the credit crisis, credit crunch rather, and the closing of the bond market that's used to fund most P3s, there was a real compounding of the long-standing problems. So this led then to many delays, renegotiations, and collapsed deals, both in Canada and worldwide. And this affected then recently initiated P3s and also P3s that were going to be initiated. So essentially the volume of new deals dropped off significantly. And just one report I would highlight is Hugh Mackenzie's 2009 report, very aptly entitled Bad Before, Worse Now, which details the increased cost and the interest rate spread and then what that means in the long run for the price of these P3s. And but maybe of even greater concern is the questioning that was sort of the questions that were raised around the P3 model in areas that you wouldn't normally expect opposition. So not just within the trade union movement or public healthcare advocacy organizations, but for instance, Scotland's finance minister called PFI or our P3s, quote, one of the worst excesses of the age of financial irresponsibility. And in Canada, the response was more muted. But for instance, BC unrolled its stimulus spending with the, and P3s were not part of that spending package. And that's, possibly because it takes them longer to be developed, to go through their various stages of bidding. But in any case, it sort of created a problem for not just individual projects, but the model itself. But rather than producing any significant change in P3 policy over the next few years, by 2010 the market began to rebound. By 2011 this accelerated, and now in 2012 it's, in Canada at least, it's essentially where it was before, and it's almost as if there had never been a crisis to begin with, and certainly not a questioning of the model, in BC and Ontario in particular, but other provinces as well. So, and this is my last slide. So how did this come to be then? How is this P3 market alive and well? Well, I would suggest that three things about these enabling fields. First, that they operate as a form of sort of what you could call soft lock-in, where, as the label suggests, they don't force governments to choose P3s, but they do facilitate and encourage their development. So the upside is that this means that these enabling fields, these items, can be easily transcended or scrapped if there was the significant political will to do so, and resistance and a concerted effort. But on the other hand, it means that small challenges, small crises are less likely to turn into an abandonment of the model, because there's an inertia that's produced and a resistance to change. So because of this then, when P3s were challenged by financial market instability, perhaps in a sense, and I don't think the analogy can be stretched too far, but I just kind of like maybe thinking about whether the external problems that were produced and then the way that the enabling field cushioned the impact of that, it's sort of like a neoliberal automatic stabilizer, like the automatic stabilizers of the Keynesian era were. And so obviously neoliberal re-regulation is going to look different than Keynesian regulation, but I just think it's something interesting to think about, whether the fact that new projects are being rolled out as if nothing had happened might have something to do with this kind of automatic role that it played. But then there's also the internal problems with P3s and the internal contradictions and dislocations that are produced. And so Bob Jessup has this idea of flanking mechanisms, essentially, that help protect neoliberal policies from their own internally generated dislocations. So, and as mentioned, I wasn't able to go into this, but there are many pragmatic elements, at least superficially pragmatic elements, and some concessions that are offered, say, through AFP in Ontario versus P3 in BC, which do help at least co-opt some resistance or assuage some of the difficulties internally with P3s. But either way, dispossession as a policy initiative is far less reliant today on ideological fervor than I would say it ever has been in the past. So to conclude, and in terms of how this relates to resistance, I don't have much to say on that. I wish I had more to say, but I guess what I would be able to add is that most often the focus is on P3 projects, and instead I think that the focus needs to shift, at least in part, to the role that these enabling fields play and the way that privatization policy has been institutionalized and depoliticized, and routines around this have been created. So, thank you.